I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, New York Times reporter Ben Oreskes has been tracking two stories that say a lot about where American politics is heading: a shaking grassroots movement in Maine and a resurgent left here in New York City. In Maine, Graham Plattner's sudden exit from the Senate race has left activists scrambling to keep their populist energy alive and Democrats racing to find a viable challenger to Senator Susan Collins. And in New York, Ben has been reporting on how Democratic Socialists are winning primaries far from the city, testing how far their message can travel. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So you were recently in Maine as Democrats there look to try to find a replacement for Graham Plattner. I'm wondering what struck you about the efforts there. What did you notice? Is it going smoothly? Is there conflict? Will they be able to choose a candidate in time?
First, let's just start with this was an extraordinary situation. You have Graham Plattner, this insurgent candidate, an oyster farmer who kind of takes Maine by storm. He has these enormous rallies. He just sort of like pulls people's heartstrings about his story of being a veteran with PTSD, sort of struggling. And he comes under intense scrutiny as he's running. He does so well at first that he drives Janet Mills, the current governor of the state, out of the primary. And then he wins the primary in early June. But as he's sort of storming to victory, a series of unflattering stories comes out about him, many in our newspaper, and they are about everything from his having a Nazi tattoo to his unflattering portrait of him and how his dealings with women. And this sort of culminates with a story in Politico and other news outlets with a credible rape allegation against him. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. He had already won the primary, but then he decides to drop out. And this leaves Maine Democrats in this very unenviable position. This is a state, one of the few places in America where in 2024, Kamala Harris won and a Republican, Susan Collins, won a Senate seat. And so this time around, they smell blood in the water. They want to beat her. And this leaves Democrats kind of straining to figure out a solution. What they have come up with is a convention of 601 delegates. 100 of those are people on their, the leadership of the Democratic Party in the state. But the other 500 have been selected from the public. Basically all you had to be was a Democrat in good standing. So over the last week, and particularly last weekend, these delegates were selected by county parties. People voted for them in this sort of amazing exhibition of participatory democracy. Once Plattner dropped out, you had several candidates jump into the race. Many of these people had just run in the governor's primary there. And the sort of through line of everyone running was they had just lost. They had just lost a primary. Or they were sort of second-tier candidates who had lost in a congressional primary. And over the weekend, we saw one of them, Troy Jackson, a former sort of leader in the state legislature. He had been involved in lumber unions, comes out of the sort of Bernie Sanders end of the party, kind of a similar vibe to Plattner, not as well spoken, certainly not as inspiring the enthusiasm that we saw with Plattner. He did very well in getting delegates into this convention that will be held in several days. And we saw, because of his success at these county conventions last weekend, the other candidates drop out. And so he has sort of become the presumptive nominee. And I mean, again, July 27th is the deadline to submit a name to the state to run against Susan Collins. They're having this convention in Bangor on July 25th. So it is down to the deadline. But again, this is everyone in Maine is talking about this. There are a range of feelings, and it's just a wild story, and one that has left Democrats very anxious about whether or not they can pick up the seat.
I mean, it feels like Plattner was, his rise was as much about his personality and what he stood for as the issues. I'm wondering if any of the people in line to replace him have that same sort of magnetism that can attract the public to their ideas.
It's a really good point. And with Jackson, we see a person who's very pro-union. A lot of the big labor groups in Maine have come out behind him. Obviously, Sanders had endorsed him in the governor's primary. We haven't heard from Sanders just yet about the Senate race, but as you said, I wrote this story having spent several days in Maine recently, and I talked to the former organizing director for Plattner, who worked for the state party briefly. But he made this point exactly as you just said, that Plattner was not just about the bullet points. He told me he was about how he inspired loyalty among constituents, and he was just a magnetic speaker. And I mean, obviously, that doesn't excuse the very bad things he did and what drove him from the race. And I think in Jackson, you have someone who is not as eloquent, but is someone who is authentic in his own way. And I think the thing that people are assessing up there is that delta, is that gap between where the enthusiasm had been for Plattner and where the enthusiasm is for Jackson. And frankly, I mean, we saw it. More Mainers voted than ever before in a Democratic primary for Graham Plattner. And he had 100,000 more votes than Jackson got in the governor's primary. Obviously, that was a more crowded field,
Right.
but there was this just intense fervor around Plattner's rise. And even after he dropped out, I and other Times colleagues have spoken to many people who wanted to see him stay in the race or felt intensely betrayed by the things we have learned in recent weeks. There was also, much of his rise was about distrust in institutions. This is a person who had served in the military, had been in the wars that this country has fought in the last 20 years. And a lot of his attraction to people was the rawness with which he spoke about foreign intervention, the inequality that we see in our economy. And that's distrust always existed amongst these voters, but it was often aimed at the Democratic Party. So this whole process has also, I think, left a lot of people bitter, feeling like there had been some ploy to drive him from the race because he wasn't the establishment pick. I mean, obviously, his behavior is what drove him from the race, but that is a feeling that is widespread among Democrats in Maine right now.
I mean, you talked about a lot of the issues that Plattner had, the Nazi tattoo. I believe his wife informed the campaign that he had been in contact with other women who were not her. And then finally, this serious credible rape allegation against him. I'm wondering the vetting process here. Did the people who recruited him, because he was relatively unknown before this, did they vet him properly? And is there anything that needs to change in the process of picking these candidates?
There's definitely been a lot of soul searching among Democrats. There's this feeling that we've heard in our reporting that, there are too many lawyers running for office and that we need people or Democrats need people running who represent America. And in Plattner, they found someone, to use a sort of cliche, out of central casting. He looked the part. He was very good at talking about his struggles. And to your question, though, I think there is a lot of frustration among Democrats who were either working on the race or invested in Plattner's success, who felt like the consultants around Plattner did not do that work or looked past red flags. Someone who had PTSD, the rumors around him had been swirling for a long time. And, there has been reporting that the Plattner campaign or the consultants around him had not done a full vet of him in that way.
And I find him in some ways similar to New York City's mayor, Zohran Mamdani, who is also, a lot of attention for his personality and his character. Is this the new model that Democrats are looking for? They're looking for like these sort of personalities that they think can resonate with the public more versus the actual issues they're fighting for?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we should not forget, the last great, politician to come out of the Democratic Party, Barack Obama, was a great orator, someone who, enlivened people, gave them hope. You heard a lot of the similar sort of spirit of that in voters who voted for Mamdani, who voted for Plattner. I think the through line for both of them as well is that they spoke with bracing honesty about the problems in this country, and they were willing to identify them and not sort of hold back. We heard both you and I, as we were watching Zohran's rise last year, heard a person who was willing to name and shame who he saw as bad actors, people he saw as hurting regular New Yorkers. I mean, I think a great example of this is recently, when the state implemented this new tax on second homes. Mamdani just didn't talk about oligarchs or rich people who had these homes that were sitting empty and were not paying their fair share. He stood outside of one of them. He stood outside of Ken Griffin, the head of Citadel Investment, who owns I think a $239 million penthouse apartment. I think it's a good example again of the directness with which they honed their message. And obviously another connection between these two politicians was the consultants working behind the scenes for them. But Oreskes, who was Mamdani's right hand for much of the campaign, is still very close to the mayor. The mayor's current press secretary obviously worked for Plattner before he shifted over. But again, so I do think we should not lose sight of the substance behind their message, but again, it was how they were delivering it as well. I mean, they were both talking about Medicare for all, abolishing ICE. Again, this inequality that we see is rampant all across the country.
Has Mamdani weighed in? Is he still going to continue to use Oreskes as his political advisor?
So far, yes, he's standing by Morris. This is someone who he's very close to and sees as an asset for him. He obviously, before Plattner had dropped out, he had said he should drop out. But he's not talked much about the race. For Mamdani, there's been this consistent tension between being a national political figure and the sort of sewer socialism, the fixing the very specific problems in the city, the potholes, the getting rid of regulations. And Mamdani, we've heard recently sort of talk about his unwillingness to weigh in on national politics or national races and doing endorsement. And it sort of stands in contrast to Bernie Sanders or an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But yeah, he's standing by Morris. And again, he called for Plattner to leave the race, but we haven't heard much more from him on it.
Plattner really built this sort of grassroots movement. You had such activity there that you hadn't seen before, some of what you mentioned. And I'm wondering, what are his supporters doing now? Are there efforts to sort of keep some of his platform alive? Because Maine is a state where Democrats see as vulnerable and part of their efforts to win back the Senate, right?
Exactly right. And again, it comes back to this gap in the enthusiasm between where it was for Plattner and where we expect it to be, or it looks like it is for Jackson. And this process that we're watching happen now, this delegate selection and then convention, a lot of the Plattner volunteers, he had 15,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls for him, which in Maine is a ton. It's not a big state. Everyone knows one another up there. Something I learned recently while being up there. You throw a rock and you meet someone who actually knew Graham Plattner or knew his parents, or it's a very small town's community vibe in that way and how they do their politics. But the significance here is that I do think there are he brought in a lot of new people into politics or excited people who had not previously volunteered before. And their ambivalence, disappointment, frustration with the party is on full display right now. And the question, again, is can they stay engaged? Will they become cynical? And so, before Jackson had kind of sewn this up, all of the candidates running were sort of talking about how they wanted to pick up the mantle of Plattner without obviously the foibles. And they were sort of talking about Medicare for all, talking about the platform that you mentioned. And you saw them trying to speak to these voters again. And then in talking to the voters, I found that didn't necessarily work, or it wasn't necessarily working. Some of them said the number one priority is beating Susan Collins. But I do think there is a not insignificant number of people who might check out of politics. I mean, in Maine, they have open primaries, or they're not exactly completely open, but there's a way, if you are not a registered Democrat, to vote in the Democratic primary. And he won a lot of votes from people who are what they call unaffiliated. So it's a question of can Jackson keep those voters in the fold? And it remains to be seen.
In your article, you spoke to someone who said Democrats blew it. They have this opportunity to take this Senate seat from Republicans. I'm wondering, what's the mood like on the ground? You were out there in Maine. Do people feel like they blew it? And in many ways, this feels reminiscent of the presidential campaign where you had a flawed candidate dropping out at the last minute, and another candidate who came in, Kamala Harris, there was an initial a great amount of excitement about her campaign, but she ultimately faltered. I'm wondering about the parallels there. Have Democrats blown it in Maine?
Again, the blame and frustration are widespread. I think there's a lot of people who are mad at Plattner, who feel betrayed. Then you have people who are mad at the media, mad at the state party, mad at these institutions. There's an intense distrust of those institutions. Plattner actually kind of bottled up that distrust and frustration and used it to his advantage. So I think you have voters who are angry in different directions, if you will. The woman you mentioned, she was at one of these county meetings in advance of their delegate selection, and she made a really smart point. She was talking to the county chair at that moment in time, and she pointed to the number of votes Plattner got, about 100, I think 60,000, and the number of delegates who would be selecting his replacement, 601. And the gap there, that the will of the voters was being subverted, and that's how these people feel. And that is reminiscent. I heard a lot of people compare this not so much to Kamala Harris, though the point you're making is real. They compared it a lot to what happened with Bernie Sanders in 2016 during the Democratic primary when he was running against Hillary Clinton, where there was this feeling, and it kind of was borne out, that the party itself was putting its thumb on the scales in favor of Hillary Rodham Clinton. And that kind of anger with mainstream Democrats, with what they call corporate Democrats, is widespread in Maine. That being said, I think there's another person who kind of should be not blamed, but at least scrutinized in this, and it's Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, who did a lot of work to clear the field for Janet Mills, who was a flawed candidate herself. She's in her late 70s, early 80s, and he anointed her as the candidate, wanted to get her into the race, and crowded out other people who might have been more credible candidates than Plattner. So then you're left with this situation where Plattner beats her handedly, drives her from the race, but then there's no one left. So I think how this race was sort of run and how he won will be looked at closely going forward. And notably, Schumer and the sort of national Democratic apparatus has stayed very far away from Maine right now. They are letting the state sort of Democratic Party, the activists I spoke to who had worked with Plattner, they're letting them drive this process because they know they're kind of toxic up there. And so it's really interesting coming out of this convention that will be held in a couple of days in Bangor, how people are able to sort of put the past in the past and move forward and again, move towards that priority, which is beating Susan Collins.
Now, in your other full-time job on the Metro Politics desk,
Let me take one hat off and put the other
hat on. We've written a little bit, you and I, together about the Democratic Socialists of America. Graham Plattner was not a DSA member, right, and was not endorsed by them, but it seemed like he was talking about a lot of the same issues that DSA talks about. I'm wondering, looking from our reporting in New York, I'm wondering how DSA's strategy has changed and how that's affecting how they're perceived by the public and voters.
Yeah, and again, I think another parallel that's salient here and worth sort of looking at is this idea that both of these groups, whether it was Plattner and the sort of movement around him, or it's the DSA in New York City, how they're bringing people who had not previously been part of politics into politics. They're giving them something to get behind. This idea that there was an identitarian quality to this, that you were meeting like-minded individuals. I talked to a lot of people in Maine who had moved there during the pandemic or living in these rural towns and found community through this campaign. And you and I have heard that among DSA grassroots members in New York City, where this was a social outlet for them and a world that was opened up to them because of the policies and the enthusiasm around Zohran Mamdani. I do think these kinds of moments work because of singularly talented orators, and in Mamdani and Plattner, you had that. But it has been impressive how the DSA has sort of shifted, or maybe not shifted, but pressed its advantages after Mamdani's win last year. So we saw them, they had been incrementalists, if you will. They had always focused on city council races and state legislative races. In Mamdani, they took a big risk. They went for something citywide. And the theory there was that even if he doesn't win, we are going to bring new people into the process. We're going to get new members. We're going to more attention on us. And so he wins. DSA membership, I think, doubles, goes from 6 or 7,000 to 14, 15,000. And there's all this energy around the group. And in that moment, rather than saying, okay, let's go back to our old strategy, they say, no, let's go find congressional races, federal offices that we can contest. And the theory there is you have bigger districts than a state legislative district or a city council district. And these races would serve as sort of anchors that helped a slate of city and statewide races go forward. And in June, we saw that theory of the case succeed in spades. They won 2 congressional seats. A third one was won Brad Lander, someone closely aligned with them. And then we saw them sort of sweep, or if not sweep, come close to sweeping a slate of state Senate and state legislative races. They won seats in Buffalo and Syracuse as well. So it was a huge night for them. The number of members of the DSA and the state legislature next year when they take office, it will go from about 9 to 16. That doesn't even count the sort of people who are kind of down with their message, but those are the people they endorsed. And even on top of that, there's another 5 or 6 people who Mamdani himself endorsed. So there's just this like new coalition that is being formed. Mamdani sits at the center of it. Obviously, the apparatus and the door-knocking prowess of the DSA, their organizing acumen, sits at the center of it. And it's a real realignment of New York politics.
In the story we wrote about the DSA, we talked about how the leader of the state assembly in New York, Carl Hastie, met with New York City DSA leaders and asked them or questioned why they were challenging incumbents. Is there a divide, a fight amongst Democratic Socialists and sort of traditional Democrats? Is that something that's going to have to be resolved in terms of moving forward?
Yes, absolutely. Carl Hastie, a fascinating figure in New York politics, a sort of from the old school. He used to run the Bronx County Democratic Party. And has had this longstanding frustration throughout his time running the state assembly with Democrats going after Democrats. He's always felt like they should be directing their fire at Republicans. There are very few Republicans left serving in the state assembly. And this was a frustration that Hastie had with Mamdani himself when he was a member of the state legislature. And it was something that he has expressed to Mamdani. I wouldn't say conditioned his endorsement of Mamdani on it last year. But I do think that we will see this be a consistent sort of flashpoint going forward. It is notable when you look at the slate of people Mamdani endorsed for the state legislature, none of them were going after incumbents. They were all running for open seats. And that was clearly about his relationship with Carl Hastie. It was clearly about having to go up to Albany next year and ask for things. Because in Carl's mind, he doesn't want to be helping people who are not rowing in the same direction as him. He's expressed that multiple times to anyone who will listen. And I think that the interesting thing about the DSA is they're not cowed by him. They relish the opportunity to go after power, and they don't sort of think that Democrats simply should just be in office because they are Democrats. And it makes a lot of these members who have served for long periods of time, run in low turnout elections, sort of skate to victory each time. It makes them nervous. And so I think we will continue to see this pressure being put on more moderate, just more mainstream Democrats going forward.
Does this success by DSA and Mayor Mamdani in their endorsements, I wonder, Governor Kathy Hochul is in the midst of a re-election campaign. How does this change her relationship with Mayor Mamdani? She's as traditional a Democrat as you could get. And I'm wondering, is there pressure on her now to sort of maybe tilt to the left? And how has she been handling that?
Again, another fascinating relationship. Kathy Hochul, a local politician from Erie County, upstate New York, becomes the governor. And now she's presented, with another mayor who kind of comes out of nowhere and has a very different background and set of priorities from her. And in a moment, I think it's worth going back to last year when Mamdani wins the primary, and mainstream Democrats, the Chuck Schumers of the world, the Hakeem Jeffries of the world, don't really rally around him. Not Kathy Hochul. She endorses him in September. And I think it is a big moment for her because he reciprocates this in the winter when she is facing a pretty credible challenge from the person serving as her lieutenant governor, and he is running to the left of her, and that sort of kills off his campaign, and he later drops out or pretty quickly after that. And so in Mamdani and Hochul, you see a really productive, they've worked already together on getting more money for expanding childcare options, a very productive but also tenuous relationship where she has expressed anger to him about his threats around budget cuts if she won't raise taxes. But at the same time, her desire to work productively with the mayor, which stands in stark contrast to her predecessor, who would always get in fights with the mayor of New York City, is something notable and something that we will be watching going forward. And we have watched her embrace, if not DSA principles, but the spirit of a lot of what they want. And I think it's a credit to both her and Mamdani, who sort of say, there are things we don't agree on, Israel being a good example, but we both care about expanding childcare in the state. Let's work on that together. Let's focus on what unites us rather than what tears us apart. And so far, it's worked. TBD on if it will continue to work, but it's put Hochul in a very strong position as she runs against the Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman in the fall. She has much more money than him. The polls show her leading by large margins. Blakeman has really tried to sort of hang Mamdani over her head and use his most extreme or out there views to her detriment. So far, it's not helped or worked. It remains to be seen if it will at all.
Quickly before you go, tell us, you wrote this interesting article about Mayor Mamdani and the soccer, the World Cup, how he views the world through soccer. New York City was one of the host cities. Tell us a bit, how has Mayor Mamdani, used soccer in a sort of political context?
I think the best place to start with this is we see politicians be fans. This man is demented when it comes to his fandom for soccer. He is pulling out.
He's an Arsenal supporter.
He's
right?
an Arsenal fan, but more than just he's an Arsenal fan, he loves the sport. It's something that him and I kind of bonded over because I'm a big soccer fan. When he was in state legislature, we would talk a lot about it when I'd see him in the hallways. He would play this game called Football Manager, which is something on your phone where you don't actually play. It's like not a video game where you're playing. You're just managing the team. That's the extent of his sort of dementedness about this. But more seriously, he saw the World Cup as this moment where New York was going to be on the world stage. And he wanted to take advantage of that, both as a fan and also as a leader of a global city. And in soccer, we sort of see his worldview coming to light, a moment where borders don't matter, identity is fluid. It is this like ecumenical vision of the world, and he talks about how much soccer mattered to him in forming his own identity. In Arsenal, you had a team that brought in lots of players from the African continent, and how much that attracted him to that team. And similarly, with this tournament and the organizing body that runs it, we have watched another big theme of the Mamdani administration, which is his pragmatism and his canniness. During the campaign, he had been very critical of FIFA. He had sort of put out this pledge he wanted to see them take around capping, ticket prices and ensuring there were seats available for locals. Much of that didn't come to fruition, but we saw someone who was able to work the inside and get things from FIFA in a way that is similar to his relationship with Trump, where he's been very critical of Trump, but he's also tried to create a relationship there that he can use to his advantage. So this last month has been just, I think, really fun for him. It came on the heels, obviously, of the Knicks victory, which he was such a focal point of and celebrating. But, Mamdani has been going to watch parties across the city. And he was actually at the final as well, but he was not sitting in the box. He was sitting in the nosebleeds. And that sort of we have seen be a theme of his when he's being at these sporting events. It's obviously him trying to make a point. But again, let's not lose sight of the fact that this man loves this sport and was super excited that this tournament was here.
My apologies to you for the U.S. team, not making the finals, but maybe
we'll
next
persist.
time,
We'll persist.
But thanks for your coverage, Ben. Thanks for your excellent political coverage in Maine and in New York City.
Thanks for your political coverage. We appreciate you as well.
All right, that's it for our show. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Jeff Mays. If you've enjoyed these conversations and want to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen.